Today is Friday, October 14th. This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. A couple days ago, I received a request for a walk talk, and it's been echoed a few times. And it's a really great topic, really challenging though, because I think it's a more profound subject than most of us are ready to believe. The question was, if I would spend a walk talk thinking about the challenge that we face in parenting, where we've got to deal with our children who are getting into some messy issues, and we're arguing about things that are difficult to talk about. We call them, the awkward subjects that parents have to talk about with their children. How should we talk about these things? Because we can see that there are a number of dangers. St. Paul said that the stuff that unbelievers do in secret shouldn't even be mentioned by saints. We really don't want to talk about immoral behavior. We don't want to have conversations where we get into the details about what sinful people do. Our minds and our talk should be modest and pure. Think about the things St. Paul said. He said, whatever is true, whatever is lovely, whatever is noble, and so on, think on these things. Those are the things we're supposed to be thinking about. We're not supposed to be spending our time talking about the details of all kinds of sinful decisions and practices, and yet we feel that it may be necessary to talk about these things with our children. We see schools trying to teach sex ed classes to kids. I remember they started teaching us that stuff in 5th grade. I can still remember the first class. And we have to ask, are these conversations actually helpful or are they harmful? Do we make children holier by talking about sinful behavior? Or do we actually do the opposite? Are we actually filling our kids' minds with ideas that shouldn't even be there? So this is a difficult issue. It's also difficult because many of us are converts, and we were immersed in sinful lives like St. Augustine when we were young. And then we had a conversion experience, and by God's grace we amended our lives so that we now try to live devout lives as adult Christians. But our children learn little by little that when we were their age, we did some or all of the things that they might be interested in doing that we argue with them about. And they accuse us of being hypocrites and saying, well, you did it when you were a kid, why can't I do it? And these are difficult situations to deal with. This whole question of talking about these difficult subjects as Christian parents with our Christian children can cause us a lot of headaches. But I think that there is a solution. I think the answer for this, I think the truth on this topic is not what the world does. It's not to go into details on all these things. It's not to entertain all of these intimate conversations and talk about all this stuff. I don't think that that's what needs to be done. And I think the reason why we feel so uncomfortable getting into those conversations is because there's something that's not right. Something's wrong. We know that we really shouldn't be getting into these things. And yet we don't know what we should do instead, and that's the challenge. And I think that I through my own experience as a parent, but also through some reflection on sacred scripture, I think I know what the solution to this is, and I think to some degree I've practiced this just because it's what has felt right to me as a father, and I'd like to get into it a little bit, think about it a little more deeply than I probably ever have, and work out some of these thoughts, which I hope will stir up some good meditations among anyone who's listening, and will also develop some good conversations in the future. So as I think about this, I don't like to have these conversations with my kids. I usually cut these things off before they start. And my kids are no saints. My kids are typical teenage kids. I think my kids, contrary to what many people assume, my kids have a lot of disadvantages because my wife and I, even though I would consider the two of us to be a devout Catholic couple, we're converts, and we don't have Catholic family. We don't have a lot of Catholic friends. In our children's lives, we are the Catholics. So there's mom and dad representing Catholicism, and then our kids don't have much other Catholic influence than that outside of the parish or some, random people that they meet here and there who happen to be Catholics. But they don't have a lot of external Catholic influence upon them outside of mom and dad. And so we've got to deal with this pressure and all of these distractions and things that come from outside. What Aunt so-and-so is doing, what Uncle so-and-so said, what Grandpa did, we've got to deal with lots of this stuff, and we have had to deal with it all through our family life. But I've never gone into these so-called intimate discussions because I don't think that they're right. I don't think that they're profitable. I don't think that they're appropriate. And I think that when we're having these discussions, we're already too far downstream. And what we need to do is get out of the stream. Rather than talk about life in the stream, going downhill, we have to get out of the stream. I talk to my wife about this, and I say, these discussions are like if a prostitute asked whether it's okay for her to serve non-Christians as a prostitute. And we would say any conversation like that is ridiculous because you can't be a prostitute. So we're not going to talk about the rules and start splitting hairs about what's okay and what's not okay for your career in prostitution. The whole thing is wrong. There's nothing to talk about. You cannot be a prostitute, period. There's no need for these detailed discussions. And if we're in those discussions, we missed the actual discussion that was needed, which is to say, you cannot be a prostitute. We're not going to talk about the details of an immoral life or the details of things that follow in an immoral life. And so I think that the problem with these conversations about awkward subjects is that we've already gone too far down the stream, and we're now stuck downstream dealing with problems and questions and issues that aren't supposed to be dealt with. And the only way for us to deal with them is either A, to prevent them in the first place, or B, to try to get back to that point of departure where the problems came in. Once we're down that stream, I don't think going deeper into the details is going to be profitable. And I'll flesh this out a bit. In following up on this question during the week, I said to a friend, what I believe is this, what I would argue is this. When we ask a question like this, we have to consider, what has God given us as a solution to this problem? What is the actual issue that we really need to focus on before we get into these situations? And what I believe it is the commandment, honor your father and your mother. I believe that the commandment to honor your father and your mother is the place where a child chooses to obey the commandment or disobey the commandment. And if they choose to disobey that commandment, they go off down the stream. The issue is one. Children, obey your parents. Honor your father and your mother. If we have a child that will not honor his father and mother, that child is going to be entangled with a million different evils. And I don't believe that we need to go with that child into all of those evils and become experts in all of the details of all of those evils. I believe the message is very simple and clear, and the message is honor your father and your mother. Our society is immersed in so many moral evils that these things have become everyday conversation. Pornography, homosexuality, fornication, dating, cohabitation, all of these topics are everyday news. And this is all evil. This is all evil. These should not be the things that we talk about. These should not be the things that we think about. We allow them to enter into our thoughts, to enter into our homes, to enter into our souls, as it were, because our society races downstream and we sort of follow along, imagining that shaking our head makes us differ, rather than realizing that we're in the same boat with all the other people heading down the stream, and we're thinking that because we disagree on some details of these immoral lifestyles or behaviors, that we're therefore different, we're not what we should be. Jesus taught us to be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect, and we're supposed to be seeking spiritual perfection in our lives. We're not supposed to be going wherever the world goes. If the world chooses to go downstream, we're not required to go downstream. We're supposed to be holy because the Lord, our God, is holy. We're supposed to pursue holiness. We're supposed to be studying the scriptures. We're supposed to be praying. We're supposed to be going to Mass. That's what we're supposed to be doing. And so if a child chooses to hang a left and turn off the course, if we go with them, the devil has not only taken down one of our children, he can hijack the whole family. And then what are we going to do? We're going to end up in a dark place where the whole family is now in confusion. And no one is living a holy life. And we're spending all of our time talking about the details of every evil thing, one of our children chooses to do. Having arguments in the dining room over behaviors that shouldn't exist in the first place, thinking that we're some kind of clever moral apologists as we allow our household to be taken over by immoral conversations and ideas that shouldn't even be present in a Christian home. And all of it goes back to one principle, which is the gate which we either keep closed or throw open. And that gate is, children, honor your father and your mother. Honor your father and your mother. And I think that what I'm saying is true because it solves a number of the problems that come up. Now, implied in all of this, assumed in all of this, is that the Catholic parents are doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is seeking spiritual perfection. If we don't seek spiritual perfection as Catholic adults, all of the arguments are going to go out the window when it's time to actually teach and discipline our children. If we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, all of the arguments are going to be lost. And so there's an assumption from the beginning that if we're concerned with raising Catholic children, if that's our concern, then we have to be model Catholics as parents. What's hard about being a parent is that our children see us at our worst. It's easy to be an employee or to go in business. You get up in the morning, you get a shower, put on nice new clothes, go out all fresh and ready for the day. You sit professionally with some other people. End of the day, you hop back in your car and drive home. It's easy to be professional from 9 to 5. It's easy to be smiley and friendly for a few hours a day when you get to come in and go home. But in family life, there's no going home, there's no end of the day, there's no time to punch in and punch out. It's 24/7 for years and years, and our children see us at our worst. They see us when we're anxious. They see us when we're slothful. They see us when we're angry. They see us when we're gluttonous. They see us when we're arguing. They see us at our worst. And therefore the pressure is on us as parents 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to model the Catholic faith. And you see, it's a superhuman task. It's a task that's impossible without grace and a lot of prudent management of the household. I really became conscious of this back in 2013 because my wife and I hosted a dozen or so boys to actually live with us for boarding school studies. They stayed with us, lived on our family farm, studied together through the day. And we hosted them throughout the school year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the constant pressure to be modeling the Catholic faith became very, very clear to us through that boarding experience because our children were still pretty young. But we had to be on our game at 6 o'clock in the morning when the boys started waking up. Every time it was time for prayer, when it was time to go to Mass, when it was time to do chores, when it was time to make meals, to clean the house, to do our work, to study, we had to be present as the models. And it was exhausting work, but we always felt that we had grace during those times. And it was funny because when the boys would leave at the end of the term, we felt like someone popped us with a knife and all of the air came out. We were exhausted and wiped out. And it seemed like that grace we had when the boys were present was taken away when the boys left. And then when a new term would begin, it was as if our strength was revived. But we felt that exhausting stress 24 hours a day, 7 days a week of serving as the model for all the students. And that really is what parents have to do in their families. They have to strive to model the Christian life. And that doesn't mean that if they stumble, all is lost. Because the reaction to sin is just as important as avoiding sin in the first place. The Catechism talks about the duties of parents, and it says that one of the important duties is to teach their children the importance of repentance and forgiveness by confessing their sins to their children. And I've always known as a father that there is no more influential act that I can perform than when I do something wrong to my children to go to them and apologize and ask for their forgiveness. There's nothing more influential in a child's soul than to have a parent who could just ignore bad behavior and walk away and not care, but rather to have that parent come and say, I need to talk to you for a minute. What I did before, what I said to you, that was sinful, and I'm sorry for that. Please forgive me. That's real religion. And that confessing of sin, that sticks with kids. They remember what that felt like. They remember what that looked like. And I don't know that there's a more influential act that we can perform in teaching our children how to be Christians than admitting when we've sinned. And so it doesn't require us to be perfect, even though we should be striving to be perfect. So it doesn't create this lazy, foolish attitude that says nobody's perfect. That attitude is false. We should be striving to be perfect, but when we fail, perfection requires us to confess our sins. And if we sin against our children, we need to confess to our children. And like I said, that has a profound effect on the children. But we need to be models of the Christian faith, and confession and forgiveness are a central part of that Christian faith. So all of this is assumed when we teach the commandment to our children, honor your father and your mother. It's assumed that the father and the mother are living and acting as the father and the mother should be living and acting. And therefore it's reasonable and right for the children to honor their father and their mother. That needs to be the focus of our conversations with our children. We need to teach them the 10 Commandments, and we need to model for them lives that are obedient to the 10 Commandments. Our children need to understand that their duty to honor their father and their mother comes from God Himself. That's not Dad's idea of what your hair should look like. That's not Dad's idea of how long your dress should be, or what kind of shoes you should wear, or what kind of music you should listen to. This isn't one of Dad's personal judgments. This is one of the 10 Commandments that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai in the ancient world, that's recognized universally as part of the timeless moral law that all men are accountable to. Our children need to understand that this command, honor your father and your mother, are part of the same law that includes you shall not kill, you shall not steal, and so on. Honor your father and your mother. If we model the Christian life for our children, and if we teach them the 10 Commandments, which the church makes them memorize in First Communion preparation, we have to make them a focal point of our family life and teaching. If we teach as the universal principle, honor your father and your mother, and use that in reasoning with our children, a lot of these issues will be taken care of very easily at the point of departure where they need to be taken care of. And if a child, and when I say child, I'm talking older child, I'm talking teenager, children who could be independent. I'm not talking a 5-year-old. As our children get older and they begin to mature and move towards the time of life where they have the right to become independent, the message needs to be simple. Obey the commandments. That's the rule. Obey the commandments. You know the precepts of the church. You know the 10 Commandments. You know the things that Jesus taught in the New Testament. That's what you should do. If you choose not to do that, son or daughter, there's nothing that I have to say to you beyond that. If you don't believe it's important to honor your father and your mother, what else am I going to say? You know what the commandment is. You should honor your father and your mother. And if you simply ask yourself, does this honor my father and my mother? And if the answer is no, and you intend to do it anyway, what else is there to say? Should we get into a detailed argument about how you can sin and how you can't sin? Or should we simply talk about whether you should sin or whether you should not sin? The commandment says, honor your father and your mother. And that commandment obviously has a meaning. And the commandment cannot mean ignore your mother and your father. It can't mean you don't have to ever listen to your mother and your father. The commandment, honor your father and your mother, obviously has a meaning, and it's a part of the moral law. And if you're not going to obey this commandment, to honor your father and your mother, what's there to talk about? I don't believe there's a need to go beyond that. I don't believe there's a need to go beyond that. We don't have to argue about whether cocaine is bad but marijuana is okay, or whether cigarettes are okay but marijuana is too far, or whether vodka is bad but a beer is okay. We don't have to get into these discussions. We don't have to get into these discussions because the real decision has already been made by the time we're in those discussions. And I can think of a good example to illustrate this in the New Testament, which I think is really, really clarifying of what's going on in these discussions. In the New Testament, at the opening of the Gospels, we find two important visits from the angel, Gabriel, the archangel. One is to Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist, and the other is to the Virgin Mary. Gabriel comes to Zacharias and reveals to him that his wife is going to have a son. His wife Elizabeth has been barren for all these years, and yet the angel says, your wife is going to have a son. And then Zacharias responds with what we call the Song of Zacharias, which we sing at morning prayer. Zacharias, however, asks a question. How can this be? How can this be? And as a result of that question, the angel punishes him with the inability to speak. He is punished for asking the question, how can this be? The same angel, Gabriel, several months later, visits the Virgin Mary at the Annunciation, says to Mary, "Hail, full of grace, the Lord is with thee," and delivers to her the good news. You are going to conceive a child, and the child whom you will bear will be called the Son of God. Mary responds to the angel, I believe, with the same words that Zacharias does. She says, how can these things be? How can this be? The same response that was found in Zacharias, for which he was punished by the angel, comes out of the mouth of Mary. And yet, when Mary asks the question, we find no punishment. We find the angel Gabriel simply provides her with a clear answer. How can this be? The angel Gabriel tells her that the power of the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and so on. So we have two people to whom something is spoken. They both respond with a question, seeking more details, seeking more information. One of them is punished. One of them is answered. What's the difference? Is the angel unjust? Does he punish Zacharias and unfairly not punish the Virgin Mary? Or is there a difference? I believe there is a difference. I believe that the response of the angel reveals that the question from Zacharias wasn't the same kind of question as the question from Mary. Mary was already disposed to obey. She was already prepared to say, "Let it be done to me according to your word." She was already disposed to obedience. Her heart was pure. Her intention was pure. Her question was a question not of doubt or a question contesting the word of the angel, but it was a question simply seeking to understand how she should go about, how she should understand what she was already ready to obey. The question of Mary was an obedient question coming from a pure heart, whereas the question from Zacharias appears to have been a doubting question. And this, I think, reveals to us the problem with getting into these awkward discussions in family life. The issue is whether the children desire to obey God or not. Whether they're interested in honoring their father and mother, or whether they've already made up their mind to disobey. And so we can think about these issues. An obedient child who has already committed to obedience can come and ask for an explanation so she can understand, or so he can understand the concept that he's already committed to obeying. He simply wants to understand. He can say, for example, we can have a discussion, hey Dad, can I do this? Dad says no, and in that child's heart, that's the end of it. Dad said no, that's the end of it. But Dad, can I just ask you a question? Why do you think that this is bad? Why do you think that this is such a big deal? That's a question from an obedient heart that's simply seeking to understand. They've already decided to obey. They're simply interested in understanding why mom or dad judges the issue in the way that they do. That's an honest, good question. And if I were to say, you know what, I really don't want to talk about it. Just trust me when I tell you that's not something that you should do. For an obedient child, that'll be sufficient. And if it's an issue that we can talk about modestly and comfortably and productively, fine. But if we don't believe it's something to talk about, the obedient child will be fine with that. The disobedient child who is already committed to disobedience may express the same question, but it's expressed with a completely different intention. And this can be seen in the way that it's expressed. The obedient child can say, Dad, why do you think that this is such a big deal? And we can feel a sense of calm and obedience in that question. The disobedient child, however, is not asking for clarification. It's protesting. They've already decided that they would like to disobey, and they want to argue. They're not really saying, why do you judge in this way? What they're really saying is, why can't I do it? What is your argument that makes you think that I shouldn't do this? And it's a completely different question. So if I were to say, no, I don't think that you should go out tonight with those kids. And the child has already committed internally that he or she wants to go out. The question is not, hey Dad, why do you think it's a bad idea to go out with these friends? The question is, why not? Why can't I? And you can see the spirit of the question is totally different. And that discussion is just headed down a bad road. Nothing positive or necessary is going to come out of that discussion. That child has already answered his or her own question by his reaction. You can't tell me that you're going to go out and be responsible or trustworthy when I can see right here at the point of departure that you're already ready to be disobedient. We really don't have to get into the details because I can already see that you're not disposed to be obedient. The commandments aren't in your thoughts. You've already got your mind made up. You've already got the plans in mind. And now we're going to get into this detailed debate about why you shouldn't do this when you've already decided that you want to and are going to. This isn't a discussion between a father and a child. This is a question between two equals. And that's not what this relationship actually is. This is not two equals having a debate about some political issue. This is a father talking to a child, and a child demanding an explanation from a father, which is simply not appropriate. We can already see this child ready to jump into the stream, and the question is not which stop along the way downstream is actually bad. The question is, should you jump into this stream or stay out of the stream? And the child has already decided that he wants to be in the stream. And the smartest thing the parent can do is keep the discussion focused on the question of whether or not you should jump into the stream. Not get into an argument about the details of that decision, of that behavior, and so on. And here's why. A father has authority over his children. He has the right to say no, and the ground for his judgment is that it's his household. He's the father, and the children are commanded to be obedient to their father. The commandment to honor your father and your mother, or to obey your parents, that commandment is like a set of parentheses that can be placed around whatever judgment a father or mother makes. The ground for why a child should listen to this or that judgment of a parent is because children should honor their father and their mother. The grounds for the command, the grounds on which it should be accepted and obeyed, are matters of authority. It should be obeyed as a matter of authority. When the child demands an explanation, the discussion runs off the rails, because the father is perfectly right to make his judgment based on authority. He doesn't have to give any reasons. The child may not necessarily even understand the reasons, and it doesn't matter because no reasons are necessary. The father can say, "That's my judgment. You should not do this." And the question for you is whether or not you're going to honor your father and your mother. And if you're not, what else is there to talk about? When the child demands an explanation, we see the child is looking for a way out of a command that's based on authority. What the child wants is for the parent to get into an explanation, to get into reasons and details that hopefully the child can find some fault with. The child is being led to try to make this decision to be about the details of the argument and the reasoning rather than a judgment based on authority. And when the parent falls for this bait and gets into this argument, what will often happen is the parent will screw up. The parent will say something that doesn't need to be said. The parent will misspeak. The parent will say something that's not accurate. And really, the judgment wasn't dependent on those details. It was simply a parental judgment that was based on authority. As soon as the parent begins rambling and gets into this argument about all the reasons, any misspeaking, any careless statement or argument will be held against the parent, and the child will act that because the parent misspoke or said something inaccurate, that the parent's judgment is now to be ignored and disobeyed. And that discussion doesn't need to take place because the parent is able to speak and judge from authority. I see this all the time with my wife because my wife has a different personality than I do. My wife will get into these arguments with the kids and start giving reasons. And my kids are pretty clever. They're pretty cunning when it comes to arguing and speaking. And they can often get her trapped in her words where she says something that isn't exactly accurate, or she says something that doesn't exactly follow from something else. And the kids then act like they have proven that she does not need to be obeyed. And that choice to enter into that argument creates that new problem. Whereas I don't do that. I tell my kids my judgment very calmly and plainly, and I say, that's it. That's it. You asked me what I thought, and I told you. That's it. If you're not going to listen to me, what am I going to do about it? What am I going to chase you around town? I have work to do today. I have my own life to live. If you choose to not listen to my judgment and you go and do what you want to do, there's no way that anybody can stop someone from sinning. And whatever you do, you're going to pay the penalty for. You're going to pay the penalty for the things that you do. If you choose not to listen to me, you're going to pay the penalty for what you do. Now, let me add a little bit more to this, because I'm not saying this to a 12-year-old kid. I'm not saying this to a 6-year-old. I'm saying this to an 18-year-old. In my family, I established a rule that none of my children are allowed to have a driver's license until they're 18 years old. And the reason why I did that was because I told my children, the minute that you drive out of my driveway, you have the freedom to make whatever decisions you want. You can drive 100 miles an hour down the road. You can go get drunk and drive drunk. You will never do those things as a minor, which would have me be responsible for your behavior. You'll get your license to drive when you're legally old enough to be responsible for whatever you choose to do in a car. And so my kids don't get driver's licenses until their 18th birthday. If my kids choose to do something illegal in a car, it's all upon them. I'm not responsible for a speeding ticket. My insurance is not going to go up. I'm not going to have my car impounded. If they choose to do something with a car, with the driver's license, they're doing it as an adult, and they're going to pay the penalty themselves. Younger children, things are different because they don't have this legal right to do what they want and all of this American stuff. Younger children are dealt differently, but at the same time, the principle is the same. I tell a younger child my will as his father, and if he chooses not to listen to what I say, then it's game on. And what I tell my children, my younger children, is if you have the right to do whatever you want to do, then I have the right to do whatever I want to do. So how about you have no dinner for 2 days? Go ahead, do whatever you want. I'll do whatever I want. And the kids quickly realize they can't play on those terms with a father upon whom their entire life is dependent. I don't get into childish arguments with my kids. I don't entertain any of the emotions. I don't sit there and let them talk back to me. I don't let them talk back to my wife either. We don't have debates about what they can and can't do. I make my judgment known very clearly to them. My kids already know everything that I think. And for the most part, they understand that they're either going to choose to do what they want and disobey and pay the penalty for it, or they're going to stay close to mom and dad, honor their father and their mother, because we're not going to talk about these things. But we don't fight about them. I don't think that that's productive, because like I said, if a kid is not concerned with obeying the commandment to honor your father and your mother, what are you going to say? What are you going to say? There's nothing to say. That's the point of departure, and they need to choose to either stay within God's commandments or go away from them, to transgress them. And there's no reasoning once we've chosen to transgress. We're not going to talk about how you can sin but not too much. We're going to talk about obeying the commandments or not obeying the commandments. We're not going to get into debates about how sexually immoral one can be in this house, how far we're willing to go. We can't talk about how drunk it's okay to get yourself, or which drugs you're allowed to use, or how many girlfriends you're allowed to have. We're not going to have any of those discussions, because I'm staying at the point of departure, and if you choose to walk beyond that point, you're walking on your own. Because I have a Christian life to live, and to be honest, Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son Isaac for God's sake, and Abraham was willing to do so. And I can say, as a Christian man, if I have to sacrifice a child by having a relationship end because that child chooses to leave the Christian life, I'm willing to sacrifice a child because I'm going to stick with God. I'm not going into the stream with a disobedient child. I'm not letting a disobedient child take over my life and cause two people to live in sin. That child is going to understand very clearly that if he goes off this path, he goes alone. Mom and I are not coming with him. And if our relationships are what they should be, if our relationships are strong and loving, built up through years of family life, that decision should be an easy one to make for most kids. And I find with my kids, when they have thoughts about doing something that I don't believe they should do, I usually find that when I express to them that I don't want them to do that, our personal relationship is usually enough, and not much more needs to be said. And obviously there's a lot more to all of this. There's a lot more in the details of these relationships. We have to build these relationships to make these methods effective. You can see if you've got a bad relationship with your kid all along, the ties that should be there to help the child at these important times of their lives simply won't be in place. And it's very easy for a child to separate. But if family life is loving and intimate, if parents are generous and friendly, if they set a good example, if they're honest, the bonds between parents and their children become very strong, and not much more needs to be said other than if you go down that path, you go by yourself. That makes that path very undesirable for a child who loves his or her parents. And if there's no bond, there's nothing to hold that kid back. That kid's perfectly happy to pack up and split. That's a problem that we can try to avoid. And I'm not saying you can avoid it, because it's just a matter of fact that there are kids who are evil. And they could have exemplary Christian parents who are loving and generous and excellent models of the faith, and they've just got corrupt wills that do not want to do what's good. And they can't get away from their devout parents soon enough to satisfy their desire to run into evil. And we'll see kids like that come out of perfectly good families. And there are other kids who may not be well parented, may not be loved by their parents as they should be, and yet they are drawn by God's grace to honor their father and their mother, and they'll be faithful to their parents even when they're given every reason to separate from them. So these things aren't simple. It's not black and white. But the point of this talk, what I hope to share, was that these so-called awkward discussions where we get into the details of immorality with our kids, I don't think those discussions are ever appropriate or productive. And if there's ever a time where a discussion like that is or may be helpful, I think it would be a situation where, in the case of the Virgin Mary, a child who is already committed to obedience simply wants to understand the judgment of the parents. But when the child is protesting and ready to disobey, those discussions are just an opportunity for a parent to make a misstep in speech and have that misstep used as a justification to reject the authority of the parents. And as a side note to this is what we see in Catholic circles today, where laymen oppose the Pope. We see the so-called scholars even demanding clarification from the Pope, not with the spirit of the Virgin Mary, because we know they're already ready to disobey him, but with the defiant spirit that demands an explanation, because they're hoping that the more they can get him to talk, the more they can get the Pope to say, the better chance they'll have of catching an awkward phrase or catching a lazy expression that they can then seize upon and amplify and try to turn into a justification for their eagerness to disobey when the Pope's judgment is submitted to the Catholic Church and to all Catholics in the Catholic Church as a matter of authority and not based on any argument. That same spirit of disobedience that we see in many Catholics today, where it's in fashion to just openly mock and defy the Pope, that same spirit of disobedience is in the kid who says, why can't I do this or that? It's not a sincere question. Thankfully, the Pope, in his wisdom, ignores those requests, which frustrates the people who ask them because they know that his silence defeats their demand for more information, which is insincere. And in the same way, I think parents need to practice the same and realize that they have no obligation to respond to any demands of their children. They have the right to express their judgment as a matter of authority, to be received and obeyed on the grounds of authority, and not to allow themselves to be entangled in these arguments, which I believe the devil baits them into, so that the children can feel that there's justification for their disobedience, when the obedience of the parents, the obedience to their parents, is not based on any of those reasons or arguments, but on authority alone. And just to wrap this up, we see the devil works like this in the Garden of Eden, where God gives a clear commandment: don't eat from this tree, period. The devil comes to Eve and says, has the Lord said that you can't eat from this tree? And Eve answers and says, yes, God said that we should not eat of it. And then we see what the devil does, and the devil says, well, why not? And Eve gets into this discussion about how if they eat of it, their eyes they will surely die. And the devil says, oh, come on. That's not a good argument. You don't have to listen. That's the kind of reasoning we find in these arguments between parents and children. It's not real, sincere questioning. It's simply a temptation to find a justification to disobey and pretend that we're disobeying on some necessary and reasonable grounds. That reasoning is not coming from God. In the Garden of Eden, it came from the devil. And to contrast that, we can look at the life of our Lord, who, when he was tempted by the devil, didn't get into a discussion with the devil, but simply responded with black and white references to the content of sacred scripture. He said, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone. It is written. And we should realize that those were responses from authority. And that's how a person lives by faith. The just shall live by faith, obedient to God's authority, and within domestic relations, obedient to the authority of parents. Once we go beyond the real question of obedience to parents, there's no more reason. There's no profitable discussion. That's where the argument needs to be kept. The grounds need to be kept as grounds of authority. And we'll see that one child will obey and another will disobey. And it's not because of the arguments. I hope that's helpful. God bless.